However you are and whenever you are, welcome back everyone to Coffee and UFOs. I'm Alan B. Smith, your most grateful host. Tonight, I have a guest that I really appreciate having on. He's been on the old podcast in the past. He's now here with us for Coffee and UFOs, and that is one of the preeminent researchers and investigators into the 1947 Roswell UFO crash. His name's Donald R. Schmitt. We'll be speaking to Don in just a moment. As a friendly reminder, this podcast is broadcast on the X network every Thursday, 11 p.m. Pacific time, 2 a.m. Eastern, Friday mornings. And of course, the podcast is posted wherever you listen to your podcast. If you enjoy this episode, if you enjoy past episodes, I'd really appreciate you jumping on any of those platforms, giving us a good review, sharing your thoughts. I really appreciate it. We continue to grow. We've got some really, really cool guests coming up this season. One in particular, Dr. Helene Powell, it will be coming on in March. And yeah, that's maybe a little bit out there, but there is a relationship to, psychic and consciousness side to the UFO phenomena. And we can't ignore the tertiary aspects of this, even if it might be borderline supernatural. And then, of course, we have traditional ufologists, more nuts and bolts on the program as well, like Kevin Knuth. And so we tackle all spectrums here. Now, tonight is definitely going to be more of a historical approach. And last week we did Aztec UFO. This week we're doing Roswell. So it's kind of a mini back-to-back series here. I think these are really important events to revisit. And I know that in this day and age, it's really, really exciting. There is something dropped in the news pretty much every week, whether it's Jack Berber, another whistleblower, David Grush, and what have you. There's just so much to keep up with. I think sometimes we really forget to look back at these past cases. And this Roswell case is and will always be, whether we get disclosure or not, the most important UFO case in history. So let's get down to it with our guest, Don Schmitt. Don, welcome back. How are you?
Good to see you again, Alan. And you won't get no argument with me. We often refer to Roswell as the granddaddy of all UFO cases.
It is the big one. And I think people forget that when you're studying the past, you're better informed to handle the future, the present day.
I could not agree more. And in fact, it's one of my pet peeves with many of the people coming into the field nowadays, that they have no historic background. They have no historic foundation of what they base their present ideology, their very opinion on the subject.
Yes. Yeah.
And the wonderful thing about, as Dr. Hynek, my former scientific director, would often say, is that the oldies were the goodies, in the sense that the skies were much more pristine back in the earlier days. There were no drones. There were very few private pilots in the skies that were flying without transponders and could not be accounted for that time. There were no Goodyear blimps or anything else that would impersonate something of an unknown origin, so to speak. The skies were rather, virgin, in the sense that jet propulsion was in its infancy. Rockets were first being tested. And as a result, when people were describing things, especially during that summer, that first flap, that first wave of 1947, of craft that were devoid of any wings or tail sections, propulsion, sound, that it was something truly unusual. That when a witness described something that was that much beyond our own, technical advancement at that time, even post World War II, it was a reason to stop and pause and ask, what are we dealing with here? Because, and also keeping in mind that the Orson Welles, H.G. Wells broadcast of War of the Worlds was just 9 years earlier. And so this too was very fresh in their memories. And as a result, I think a lot of people came away first believing that it had to be our technology. I mean, my God, we had just, unleashed the most tremendous weapon known to man at that time with the atomic bomb just 2 years before. And where was it tested, no less, but New Mexico? And then you have this. You have whether or not Roswell Army Airfield puts out that most famous press release that they had actually captured a flying saucer. In other words, the first atomic bomb squadron in the world, which was headquartered at Roswell at that time, actually would claim we got one.
Right. Well, I have to tell you that as a volunteer MUFON field investigator in New York, I almost wish I knew what it was like to be a MUFON investigator 20 plus years ago, because some of the descriptions of the objects that we get 20 plus years ago would truly be anomalous. But now I have to put them in that could be a drone basket. And it's really frustrating because you just don't know. And someone could truly be looking at a UFO from a distance, but you wouldn't know the difference. It's tough, but we do have a lot of technology now and sensor systems that are assisting in this. Even with like MUFON, you have the MADAR, which is a tracking system, so you can kind of see if, hey, did anyone else track any electromagnetic anomalies in this area? There are other ways to try to go about and figure out what's going on here. Very quickly, I do want to tell the audience I received some feedback about last week's episode. There was some audio issues. I cleaned up that audio file, so if you were listening to the podcast, I cleaned that up so you can just refresh your feed and you have a much cleaner version of that audio. And quickly, Donald, let me just read your bio here for anyone who just isn't too familiar. So Donald R. Schmitt is a former special investigator of the late Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who was the scientific consultant to the Air Force Project Blue Book. After Hynek founded the Center for UFO Studies in Chicago, Schmitt would become his director of special investigations and served on the board of directors for 10 years. A 7-time best-selling author, his first book, UFO Crash at Roswell, was made into the Golden Globe-nominated Best Picture Roswell. He is also a co-founder of the International UFO Museum and Research Center at Roswell, New Mexico, and co-founded the International Coalition on Extraterrestrial Research. You are all things ET and UFOs. All right. So tonight's theme, if we will, Don, is I want to flip the script on debunkers. So very briefly, can you sum up the elevator pitch version of what happened in 1947?
Well, as I had originally described, that in the summer of 1947, just south of town, the Roswell Army Airfield was the headquarters of the 509th Bomb Wing, first atomic bomb squadron in the world. They were the elite within the military at that time. They were the best officers, best pilots, crew, doctors, nurses, all handpicked, and then all placed in that composite squadron in charge of the atomic bomb. None like them in the world. And they all happened to be there at the time of this crash of this craft of unknown origin about 65 miles northwest of Roswell. And it happened to be, over a 4th of July holiday weekend when most of the base personnel are home on leave with their families. Skies are clear. Nothing's been reported missing. Nothing is being tested. So what does this represent? A ranch foreman by the name of W.W. Brazel would report a debris field of the strangest material that covered an area of almost a mile long. He would report it to the county sheriff, George Wilcox, there in Roswell, who in turn then notified the military. Well, it was the very base commander. So just imagine, it's a holiday weekend, and it's important enough that they alert the base commander himself that we have a crash. And the material we can't identify. We've never seen anything like this before. So instead of just humoring the rancher and sending out a couple of enlisted men, Colonel Blanchard sends out his two lead intelligence officers, Major Jesse Marcel and the head of counterintelligence, CIC, Captain Sheridan Cabot, to go and investigate. The next day, they would load up 2 entire vehicles of the wreckage. They would contain as much of the remaining material as they could. They arrived back at the base first thing Tuesday morning, July 8th, and at noon, they put out that famous press release. When I say they, the Roswell Army Airfield. Again, the people in charge of the atomic bomb announced that they had captured a flying saucer. Well, to get ahead of the skeptics right here, they are the ones who made that claim. I'm not making it. My original partner, Kevin Randall, didn't make it. We were skeptics. We went down to New Mexico thinking we would wrap this up in a single weekend.
Yeah.
And then you actually start speaking with the first-hand witnesses who held that exotic wreckage, whether military or civilian. And they're all reading from the same script. They're describing it identically.
Yeah.
And you realize there's nothing conventional about this. And we need to get back down here as soon as possible. And so it became not only a race with the Undertaker, as we would describe it, because of the attrition rate. It was 40 years after the incident, and we had a lot to make up. And we already had lost a good number of the principal witnesses, had passed on. And so the more we dug into this, the more we realized that not only was this one of the biggest cover-ups of all time, but we were also potentially dealing with the biggest story of the millennium. Biggest story in the last 1,000 years.
Yeah.
And so we found, especially within the officers, they were the most reluctant to speak to us. They were the ones who were, had the most to lose. They had taken oaths of secrecy. They had pensions at stake. They, there are other benefits, and as a result, they'd be breaking that security oath. But it all stemmed back to that first primary witness, Major Jesse Marcel, the head of intelligence of the 509 Bomb Wing, the lead intelligence officer in the United States military, who would become the patsy, who was ordered to pose with the weather balloon, which would become the then second explanation to what had all been required.
And wasn't he in charge of the security too, of including nuclear capabilities as well?
Yes, you are absolutely correct.
That's like a very serious position.
He would write the briefing paper for then President Truman, as far as when the Soviet Union detonated their first atomic bomb in August of 1959. So 2 years after Roswell, where he was the fall guy, he's ordered to pose with the balloon, and they made the look as though he couldn't tell the difference of off-the-shelf material of neoprene rubber and a radar reflector kite of foil, wooden sticks, string, and tape, off-the-shelf material any 5-year-old would recognize. And here he's in charge of the atomic bomb, and he's not demoted for it. He goes on and he works at the Pentagon and he writes up that report for the president.
Right.
And so we were starting to observe too, there was a lot of inconsistency in the official reaction to what had transpired. We saw that the officers involved would be promoted.
Yep.
Colonel Blanchard, the base commander, he goes on to become a 4-star general by the age of 50. I mean, he's just made the biggest blunder in military history, claiming that a weather balloon was a flying saucer. And those were, that was the reprisal that he was subjected to. Marcel, as I described, he goes on, writes the report for the president, and on and on and on. And then, as far as to the contrary, all the civilians involved were physically mishandled, they were kidnapped, they were abused, they were intimidated, they were threatened, because being non-military, you just can't order them. They had to strong arm them. They had to make sure that these people would not speak out of line, and they also maintain the party line, so to speak.
Right.
That it was explained away as a weather balloon device, and that they all had to be on the same page.
Let me play this just to give people some context. Because some people have never heard this before. This is a radio broadcast around the time this happened.
The ABC broadcast, right?
Let's see if it. One sec, everybody.
That's it.
Edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile, found sometime last week, has been inspected at Roswell, New Mexico, and sent to Wright Field, Ohio, for further inspection. Late this afternoon, a bulletin from New Mexico.
Now, later in the broadcast, we do hear them quote Ramey having changed it to, I think it might be something like a kite.
Yes. Yeah.
Something along those lines.
Yeah. And General Roger Ramey was Colonel Blanchard's boss. He was the head of the 8th Air Force, which oversaw the 509 bomb wing at Roswell. Ramey was at Carswell Army Airfield in Fort Worth. And after Roswell had put out the press release, Ramey wanted to have a press conference. We're going to actually show the media the pieces of the flying saucer, but we're not going to do it in Roswell. We're going to do it from my office. So Major Marcel was ordered onto a B-29 bomber called Dave's Dream. They arrive in Fort Worth, and Marcel would take a box of the actual wreckage and place it down on the general's desk. Well, Ramey takes him to a map room, and when they return, Marcel is shocked to see that the wreckage is gone. And in its place, scattered on the floor in front of the general's desk, is this clump of rotting, smelling neoprene rubber, the balloon, and a shredded radar reflector kite, foil, sticks, string, and tape.
Yeah.
Now there's a hallway of reporters waiting to see the just arrived flying saucer wreckage. Well, General Ramey would only allow one reporter into the room, and that was James B. Johnson of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. And Marcel is ordered to crouch down, and he poses for 2 pictures. He holds up a section of the radar kite, and end of story.
Don, you know what that reminds me of? It reminds me of the Arrow historical report when they had the closed press briefing the day, I think it was the day or earlier that day before the report came out, so that they can control the narrative of the press.
Right. Precisely. And especially back in 47, where the military walked on water post World War II. And they were the final word. And that's all it would take. But as you're absolutely correct, Alan, they needed to control the narrative. And it was high risk in the sense that, well, first you claimed you captured something that extraordinary, and here you're reeling it back and claiming, oh, sorry, it's nothing more than a weather balloon.
Well, quickly to that point, I think one of the big contentious arguments there is the fact that, would they or wouldn't they confuse the materials? Now, I remember there was an old UFO Hunters episode where they had like Jesse Marcel and Earl
Fulford. Great.
Fulford, yeah. Look at random pieces of metal and said, hey, what does this remind you of? Does this remind you of the metal that you handled?
Right.
And neoprene seemed to be pretty darn close. So, from your research, what is the likelihood that something at that time could have crashed with that amount of neoprene or something that they might have confused?
Well, the closest thing to the neoprene that any one of the witnesses described was a black bake light, almost like a hard plastic
Hmm.
that was described, amongst the wreckage. But what Fulford, who was part of a follow-up cleanup detail, described that he was on all fours, hands and knees, and he had a knapsack draped over his shoulder, and he was grabbing pieces of this foil-like material, and he would crunch it in his hand as he would grab it, and he would toss it into that sack, and he would describe how he could feel it as it was opening up, as the pieces were returning back to their original shape, and they would start poking him in the back. So he was
Weird.
giving us a great visual of what he personally experienced.
So that really doesn't track with neoprene then.
No. And whether it was Fulford or Brazel, the rancher, his son Bill, Bill's wife Shirley, whether it was the sheriff and the deputies, whether it was the fire department, whether it was all the other men who were involved, like Robert E. Smith, Sergeant Robert Smith, and talking about how a sergeant walked up to him and out of his shirt pocket pulled out a piece that was about as big as the palm of his hand. And he said, "You ever see anything like this before?" And he's watching how, no matter how often he would grip it and crunch it in his hand, every time he would release his grip, it would just flow like water between his hands.
Right. Now that's an interesting description. Also, I do know, or maybe I'm wrong here, but my experience with anything neoprene, if you squish it and scrunch it enough, it can leave creases.
Yes,
Even if it goes back to its original form, essentially, there could still be little creases and folds visible, right?
And neoprene hardly would, as Marcel described, how engineers back at the base took a 16-pound sledgehammer and they proceeded to pound on a section of this and not even a scratch.
Right.
And see, they had a hard time discerning whether, and they would describe it that it was either metal-like or plastic-like, that it had qualities and it resembled one or the other, but it was still something beyond that. It was still something that they couldn't, specifically say was metal, because it resembled our own metals as we knew them.
Right. So these are all what we call, we've always referred to them as witnesses. Do you consider Jesse Marcel, for instance, a whistleblower or a witness?
Oh, absolutely, a whistleblower.
Okay.
In fact, when we worked with the late Congressman Stephen Schiff of New Mexico, and we were pushing for, and this would have been in the early 1990s, and we were pushing for congressional hearings on Roswell. And he was trying to get the cooperation at that time of the Secretary of Defense, who was Les Aspin. And that was when the General Accounting Office, as it was known back then, the GAO, Congress's own investigative organization, did a systematic search of documents through all branches of the military, as well as departments of intelligence. Any document, anything pertaining to the incident at all, was to be, as far as, turned over to the GAO for congressional review. Now, the Air Force's report on Project Mogul, same balloon device, but it was part of a top secret Russian spy program. And they had that press conference. That was Colonel Richard Weaver in September of 1994.
Right.
And that report and the secondary report was over 700 pages long, whereas the GAO's report on Roswell was a mere 27 pages because nobody could find anything. So they claimed total ignorance on any aspect of the case.
Sure. Well,
Now,
we've heard before. Oh, we have a procedure of, um, removing files or deleting files or whatever.
and
After
anything that
certain.
would potentially threaten national security
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
we're not at liberty to disclose.
Mhm.
But the point being, Alan, we had over 100 firsthand witnesses alive with us at that time. They would have all been whistleblowers. You had mentioned David Grush, who I've met with, who I've talked with. He's not a whistleblower by the true definition of that term because he is not firsthand.
Right. But
He,
Jack Berber would be, right?
Jack River would be.
Right.
And
Okay.
so we have raised the ante, and that's wonderful. And
Mhm.
hopefully that will spawn other firsthand. That's what it's going to take. But my biggest regret is that we could have provided them with an entire litany, an entire, as far as courtroom full of firsthand.
Oh,
And now they're all gone. Now they're all gone.
it would have been amazing if in the 80s or early 90s you had something, like that, where you could bring everybody into the same space and testify. That would have been,
We tried.
yeah.
Oh,
Well, do
whole
you
different
think?
atmosphere today. So, but I'm sure all of them are smiling down and they're going, well, at least Roswell remains on the table,
Yeah.
whether it has been in discussions with Congressman Burchett or Grothman. I've had good meetings and good discussions as far as with Lou Elizondo about this.
Hmm.
And no one is telling me it didn't happen. Even Don Trump Jr. has brought Roswell up on numerous occasions, even to his father, where his dad, the president, has made comments about Roswell. And we know before that Bill Clinton has made positive comments about Roswell.
Sure.
So, and as much as they try to put that genie back in the bottle, it refuses to go away.
Well, I'm glad to hear that the likes of Lou Elizondo are reaching out and having conversation with you, because that's important. Like it's too big of a topic of a history for any small group of people to handle on their own. You
It's
need the collective.
absolutely, and
Yeah.
it is the one case that could blow this open overnight.
Sure, and we're here. Yeah.
Because that's what also frustrates me is that, during any of these hearings where they talk about documents, maybe they talk about photographs, maybe they talk about gun camera footage, they talk about film.
Hmm.
Well, why don't we go back to, the movie Independence Day, where the president basically says, show me the bodies, show me the wreckage.
Right. Yeah.
That's all it would take. That's what I went over and over with as far as Congressman Grothman about. All you have to do is ask to see the physical evidence, and
Mhm.
Roswell is the one case that can provide. Everything else is very fleeting. Now you see it, now you don't. But Roswell, you're talking about something we took possession of.
Right. Let's quickly go back to that history so we can connect what we see in the news now with reports related to Roswell and other UFO reports, such as egg-shaped
Mhm,
craft, which
mhm.
is really interesting. So, can you parse this out? What do we think the actual shape of the craft was that crashed at Roswell or Corona?
The witnesses at that time of the general phenomena were describing domed discs, but just as often they were describing craft the shape of the heel of a shoe. The famous William Rhodes photographs or Phoenix, for
Mhm.
example, the two shots, and it was the heel of a shoe, that type of thing. Um, because the craft at Roswell it was a midair explosion. Even Major Marcel, when they first arrived at the scene of the crash, the debris field, he would say that their immediate impression was not only, my God, there's so much wreckage, but based on the pattern and the fact that it covered an area so extensively that it was a mid-air detonation that whatever caused it to break up, that it rained debris. It wasn't a point of impact. It was where it just showered the area with wreckage as it had this malfunction, this explosion. Okay. So I don't think they were ever able to piece together enough to come up with the actual shape. But then the main impact point, just 35 miles north of Roswell. The debris field is 65 miles northwest of town. The impact point where they would recover the remains of the craft and the crew, the bodies, it was like a pod, a capsule, size of a Volkswagen Beetle. We had numerous men say that it was the size of a small car, and all described it as egg-shaped.
Interesting.
So that was back in 47, egg-shaped. Now, that doesn't mean that the original craft was egg-shaped, but at least that portion of it.
That's a good point. That's a good. We shouldn't jump to conclusions, right? So, are we talking about a collision in the air?
No. There was, as we have confirmed with the Stallion Weather Network lookout site, we have the documents, and as the ranchers had described, that there was a severe lightning storm that very evening that came off of the southern tip of the Capitan Mountains. It's the beginning of the monsoon season through New Mexico, where you can get torrential rains. You can get 6 inches of rain in one pasture on a ranch, and then an area drop just a half a mile away, that type of thing. Yeah. But wicked thunder lightning storm that came up, and ranchers described that between the thunderclaps, they heard what sounded like an explosion. So it's long been speculated, well, maybe it took a direct hit from a bolt of lightning. It's high desert where the lightning actually strikes the ground. There aren't, it's open range, so there aren't any buildings, there aren't any tall trees. And so it may have been, that fatal, bolt of lightning that may have caused this. But something that he's a former radar engineer who worked with the CIA. And he suggested to me, he says, Don, you need to check out the radar systems through New Mexico at that time. And because of the atomic bomb having been detonated just 2 hours west of Roswell in June of 1945, just 2 years before Roswell, before the crash, and then the White Sands Proving Grounds just to the south of Trinity, and you had all the testing of the captured German B-2 rockets after World War II. So White Sands had the most powerful, most, at the time, sophisticated radar system in the world at that time. And then you had another system up at Kirtland Air Force Base. You had another system in Roswell. You had another system in Vaughn, New Mexico, in the central part of the state. And you had another system just to the east at Cannon Airfield in Clovis, New Mexico. He said, Don, check to see where all of those radar lobes intersected. And we did. And sure enough, they all intersected in that high desert region of Lincoln County where this crash took place.
Okay.
Now, let me quickly just point out, because radar was in its infancy at that time and it was unregulated, that there was no control of the power, the frequencies they were using, that there was no testing, there's
no stopgap.
As far as, and then the idea that these different lobes would intersect and what effect they may have on aircraft. So then we're talking to pilots who talked about flying through that area, that it would jam their instruments, that it would have a negative effect on their aircraft. So it's something new we're looking into. We want to find out what the different frequencies were from those respective radar systems,
Mhm.
and then let's put it in a lab. Let's see what it does.
Presumably, you would think that the military has already researched this, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So could there be some documents? Could there be something out there?
We would hope so, or at least that once we are able to establish such inconsistencies with the radar systems at that time, that then we would have ammunition, that we could even hit them legally, that this is what we have determined. Now, what did you determine back at the time of the incident? And if they were, and the point is, they would have to be careful in even acknowledging such testing, because why would they be required to do that if this was merely a balloon?
What I need is a portable version of that for drones.
Yes.
Because people just fly drones all over the place indiscriminately. And it's like, we need to get a handle on this, like seriously.
And it's an excellent point, Alan. And I think that maybe that's what they have been testing over the last couple of months, especially focusing on New Jersey, where they lifted a lot of the restrictions within just the last few months. And Amazon is getting ready to use drones as far as their part of their delivery system. And so maybe that's exactly what they've been looking into, and it's what type of new restrictions they're going to have to exercise as to how this won't, create new potential, disasters and accidents, and especially after what just happened last evening again.
Yeah,
that this may force me to clamp down even harder on such systems in the future.
I mean, that's such a tragedy, and it's horrible.
Yeah.
I just can't believe what we saw with our own eyes on video too.
Well, just a quick editorial comment. I just, and for as often as I think any one of us have flown into Reagan, the idea that the military would be sharing commercial airspace.
Right.
I mean, and that's what now they're asking that question.
Like what happened?
Yeah. Why? I mean, and it's just one of their natural approaches. It's just a commercial flight. Granted, it was vectored into as far as it was diverted to another runway, but nonetheless, it's still commercial airspace. And what is a military helicopter doing as far as conducting a training exercise over a commercial base or a airport? I mean, I'm sorry.
Yes, that's it's 100% wrong. That should not be the case. It makes you kind of wonder: did somebody go rogue? Did somebody get sick? Like you almost don't want to believe that it would be so disjunct, and there was no communication there, and the logistics would be so all over the place.
And that's the thing, Alan. And we were, as we were watching it last evening, and we were all glued to our television sets. And it was one of the things that came out very early, that as the tower was radioing the helicopter and trying to get them to acknowledge that they saw the approaching commercial flight, the American Eagle flight coming in. And all at once, there was no response. And that was before the actual impact. So did something happen? Did the pilot, did they black out? I mean, we don't know. Again, we may never know. But the point being, why was there a breakdown in communication just at the most crucial moment?
Yeah, and I know we're just speculating because you don't have any information yet.
Right.
But Dagger in comments makes a good point. Like, hey, maybe it was remotely done. Is that even a possibility?
Well, actually, it is, because it was just 3 months ago that the Army demonstrated, because the Apaches are headquartered out of Langley, out of CIA headquarters, and that they demonstrated just 3 months ago how they can remote fly the Apache helicopters. So again, rank speculation.
Sure.
But was somebody else, or that somebody was able to hack into the system, and that they take control of the? I don't know.
Yeah.
That's the investigator in me that is always asking the questions that need to be asked.
Right. And that brings us back to the debunker thing, because I'm definitely hung up on this. What good investigators do or researchers do is ask and ask and ask and ask questions. Often the debunker presents a potential explanation and then leaves it on the table. I'm done.
I'm done.
That's it. Yeah.
They become fixated on one answer, and it's like what Stanton Friedman used to always say: "Don't bother me with the facts. My mind is made up." And the fact that here I am now, 30 years of having looked into Roswell, investigated Roswell, we've interviewed over 600 witnesses who were either directly or indirectly involved. We've had now 5 archaeological digs at the crash site.
Yeah.
We've secured over now 30 deathbed confessions, all admissible in a court of law. We have submitted, dozens of FOIA requests concerning Roswell and the people who were involved, and yet we're the debunkers. And so I was a skeptic. So it's great to maintain a healthy skepticism on everything. But what you've described, Alan, are the scoffers, the debunkers. This is the answer because I say it is. Accept it because I tell you it's the solution. Without having spoken to a single witness, without having ever been to New Mexico, they have the final, at least in their minds and their supporters. And I'm sorry, there's nothing scientific about that whatsoever.
Where are we with the alternative theory of a Russian psyop operation?
Yeah.
Because I know
Annie Jacobson.
Annie Jacobs, yeah.
Yeah, her book on Area 51. And it was an appendix that received more attention than the entire book because she claimed that she had a whistleblower who had worked at Area 51 and that they had the remains of the craft from Roswell, and that it was nothing more than a Horton brother flying wing from Nazi Germany that was recovered by the Soviet Union, and with the help of also captured Dr. Death, Dr. Joseph Mengele.
Yep.
Yeah, that they took 13-year-old children and mutated them to appear alien in appearance and placed them on board this flying wing, crashed it in the central part of New Mexico to make us believe that we were being attacked, we were being invaded by beings from another planet. War of the Worlds Part 2.
Right.
Well, it was ABC Nightline who exposed who her source was. He was formerly with the Atomic Energy Commission. And when they spoke to him, he acknowledged that it was just an opinion on his part. And he just kind of laughed it off and said, well, I was just trying to help her sell some books. But then,
so can you trust somebody like that?
Well, not at all, because if we had a witness like that, he would not even be a witness. Nobody that we would cite or source on anything. But then factually, something that we immediately demonstrated. There was only one prototype of a Horton brother flying wing even recovered, as presently at the Smithsonian Museum. And it's constructed of tubular bicycle frame and varnished sheets of wood.
It's like balsa wood, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's the extent of it. So, but reinforced and waterproof with varnish. The Soviet Union never recovered any such prototype. And again, they were nothing but prototypes. These were still all on the drawing board, and most of the diagrams, most of the blueprints had all been destroyed by the Nazis before the fall of Berlin. As far as Dr. Death, Joseph Mengele, he was not captured by the Russians. He also, like many of the other Nazis, he made it to South America. And he even bragged about the fact with pictures that he married a beautiful Argentinian girl on the beach off of Argentina. And he lived out the rest of his life there.
Well, that's just astonishing, isn't it?
When you can't place your key figures at the scene of the crime, I'm sorry, it's a non-secular, it's a non-starter.
Right.
And yet I was asked about her again just the other day. And it's like, I'm sorry, it doesn't even qualify as, any, solution to Roswell or even an alternative explanation, because there's absolutely nothing about it that is accurate, factual, genuine, or historic. Nothing.
Well, okay. So speaking of historic, I want to go back to Earl Fulford for a moment. The plains of San Augustine, apparently there was another debris field there, or is that a separate? Go ahead.
Separate incident. But again, nobody has spent more time looking into not only all the archaeologists who were working the plains of San Augustine, which is about 2.5 to 3 hours west of Roswell.
It's far. It's like, 75 miles away or something like that.
If any of your audience ever saw the movie Contact with Jodie Foster, that was filmed at the Large Array, with all those, as far as the SETI program, that's part of it right there. These huge radar dishes.
There's like 28 radars spread
on railroad
out.
tracks that they are able to maneuver and shift them and point them in whatever direction necessary. But that is just north of the plains of San Augustine, and we've been there many times as well. So we tracked down every archaeologist, anyone and everyone who was working the plains at that time. The famous Bat Cave, as it was labeled, as it was called by the archaeologists. We've been there. And what we have been able to determine is that in 1945, there was a plane crash of a transport craft that had come down through the plains at that time, had scattered wreckage and bodies for miles. And that a lot of the locals, the ranchers, they came in afterwards and retrieved pieces of the wreckage, the aircraft, for souvenirs. The area had been cordoned off because of the bodies and the necessity to respectfully, gather the remains. And then in conjunction with, just to the south, the White Sands Proving Grounds, whenever they would conduct a rocket launch from White Sands, they would go into the plains area and evacuate. They would remove all the ranchers and their families and put them up at a motel in Socorro during the launch period, so they weren't witness to any of the secret testing. And so that all became part of the urban legend. Crash of the airplane, the evacuation by the ranchers, and then that we discovered, we've been to the site, there was a radar tracking facility also out on the plains in conjunction with the rocket launches. So the military was always in and out and observed by the ranchers in regards to that. So it became part of that legend that contributed to the connection to Roswell, when in reality, there was no connection.
So where does that leave, Earl Fulford's testimony? Because, he did describe a metal like that of what Jesse Marcel and Major Marcel described.
Well, as I mentioned, Earl and all the other men who were involved, the debris field, that was the original rancher ranch foreman W.W. Brazel, who reported the find, that it thereafter would take 50 to 60 troops, 3 full days around the clock to clean up that area. We even tracked down the original drivers of the trucks who were transporting the wreckage back to the base down in Roswell and then returning with another empty truck. And Earl was on the tail end at that location. In fact, if the UFO hunters, that's where they took him.
Right. Okay.
They took him to that location, and that's where he was able to describe on all fours with the gunny sack and placing the wreckage into that bag.
So that was like, so do you think he confused the two separate debris fields? Is that
No, it wasn't Earl. It was his granddaughter who then later conflated.
Okay.
He was the one, and because she was essentially inserting herself into the story, and so she tried to, draw the original connection. And
okay, understood.
her grandfather and we had talked to Earl how often we were the ones who arranged for him to come into Roswell, and then even before he died, we talked to him yet one last time, and he was so pleased that he was able to come back to Roswell, that one final, opportunity, and then actually go out to the site and describe his own personal experience.
Yeah, I mean, he seemed very sincere, and his recall seemed, quite intact.
Yes, right? Yes, and that's the thing I also always point out, Alan, and these same debunkers, they always, how can you trust the long-term memory of all these older people, that type of thing. Well, for those of us who are old enough to remember the Kennedy assassination, November 23rd or 22nd of 1963, the impact it had on us. I can tell you comments that I overheard my parents make at that time. I can describe the reaction when I was in 4th grade in school, the nuns reeling in the portable television, and to watch them crying as we got the news of what had just transpired down in Dallas. And the point being, we weren't in Dealey Plaza. We didn't witness this firsthand, but yet we will remember this the rest of our life. Same thing can be said about 9/11.
Oh, I remember exactly where I was when I first heard the news. I was on my way to work, and then I remember the employees that I can't remember their names, but I can remember exactly the things that they said and did. It's astounding. Like certain memories are really burned into your brain,
and especially when it's something unique, something profound, something that makes that that indelible imprint on our very psyche. And the same can be said about the witnesses at Roswell, that it was something as mundane as a balloon. I could see that their memories would be very foggy and tainted as far as in their recall. But because it was something, as Major Marcel would say, I held it in my hands and it was not from this earth. You're not going to forget that. No.
I have to ask you this. I know I've asked you again. So where before, how many bodies do we think were recovered?
Based on all the eyewitness accounts, and there was even a secondary body site about 2.5 miles southeast of the debris field, along the same trajectory line. And it was the rancher Brazel, in the company of a number of children, including his son Vernon, a neighbor ranch hand's son by the name of Sidney Wright, and then Floyd and Loretta Proctor's son, Timothy D. Proctor. And it was Timothy who took his mother, Loretta, up to the top of this bluff. And all he would say is, this is where Mac, W.W. Brazel, this is where Mac found something else. And Brazel had already described to others, including reporter Frank Joyce, finding bodies and that the stench was horrible. So there were 2 bodies found at that location.
Mhm.
And then at the impact site, which we discussed earlier with the egg-shaped craft, there were 2 more bodies located there and a survivor, a lone survivor. And of that as well, we have firsthand military as well as the civilian, the police, sheriff's department, the fire department, and even the base personnel at the hospital who described the survivor.
Don, what is the most frustrating debunker effort against the case for Roswell? We've already kind of talked about, Mogul and the kites and all that, but besides that, what else can you think of? What recurs and you're like, gosh, just let it go?
Well, the very fourth explanation,
Mm-hmm.
which the Pentagon had this growing dilemma in that we were coming up with, and we were getting the testimonies of more military describing the bodies.
Yeah.
Now, it's one thing to explain away, the strange material that you could claim was just something advanced, something new that we were working on,
Mhm.
but we were talking about non-human remains. Then how do you explain that away?
Right.
I mean, we didn't have a Joseph Mengele, and so they'd have to really come up with something, beyond the pale. Well, they came up with the anthropomorphic wooden crash dummies, and it was Project Excelsior and Project High Dive, which did not originate until 1952,
Right.
5 years after the incident. So then the Pentagon came up with the new medical malady known as time compression. You won't find it in a single medical journal anywhere in the world.
Mhm.
The idea that not only as you get older do you start to confuse the years, but also the decades. Now,
Right.
the worst problem for that is, and we quickly put out a press release to the Pentagon, at least alerting them to the fact, okay, you can try to explain away all the bodies as being 6 foot tall, wooden crash dummies with plastic and metal hinged limbs, wearing jumpsuits and harnesses and parachutes and helmets. None of our witnesses have described anything of that sort. But we are also informing you that none of our first-hand witnesses to the bodies were in New Mexico in 1952. And a point being that 47 we can historically establish as being the time of the crash based on when they put out the press release, when it all happened.
That's brilliant, because they weren't even in this alternative place that
Precisely.
right.
Precisely.
Okay. Yeah.
Precisely.
So they couldn't possibly have confused the memory because they weren't there.
They weren't there. They weren't
Right.
there. But
Mhm.
again, it doesn't matter. Don't bother me with the facts.
Right. See, oh gosh, you must miss Stan Friedman.
Oh, I do.
Yeah.
In fact, Alan, in the last 2 weeks before he died, he called me, left messages on my answer machine 3 times. Hi, Don, it's Stan. I saved them. And so every so often I play him back. And Stan, and most aren't aware of the fact that in the last few years of his life, he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's.
Okay. I didn't know that.
And he would always have me sit next to him if we were to do a press conference or a panel discussion, because I would mouth him answers, under my breath. And because we were, it's not that we were covering it up. It's like, again, it was the most private of all ailments. And we just didn't feel that the press or anyone, until Stan was ready, had the need to know, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But he would always slap me on my knee under the table and go, Don, that's why I love you. That's why I love you. And we were very close. And I do miss him. Just as Dr. Hynek, I don't think there's a day that goes by that I don't think, now, what would Alan say or what would Alan do? And I
Yeah.
feel the same way about Stan. So I could not have had better friends, better mentors, a better scientific director, and the fact that in many respects I'm finishing what they both started, and I'm just as committed as ever.
Yeah, and I'm grateful. I'm grateful you are, Don. Seriously.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I do appreciate you. I appreciate your work. I respect your work. And I do have one more question. This is from much earlier, so I can't scroll up and find it. But someone did want to know what your work was like under Dr. J. Allen Hynek.
Oh, again, I could not have had a better, example of just not only the methodology, but what the requirements were in establishing, after eliminating all alternative conventional explanation, then and only then would something be classified unidentified. And it was sad in the sense that we would be in the field, we'd be working together, and he would often make the comment, I'm an old man in a hurry. I'm an old man in a hurry. And I don't want to ever get to that point.
Yeah.
That I would feel the pressure of the clock ticking. Time was running out, and I still needed to get so much of it done. Alan was looking in the Roswell. He was investigating Roswell. We weren't even aware of it till after we would find files, notes of interviews he was conducting in New Mexico that we were not even aware of.
So Hynek was taking it seriously in the background.
Absolutely. And the whole notion of crash retrievals and the late Leonard Stringfield, and the fact that Stringfield had pretty much established the crash retrieval phenomenon in the late 1970s. And that as Hynek, again, as an old man in a hurry, he saw that his best bet was to establish that we had one, that we actually had recovered the remains of a craft and crew. And let me just end by telling a quick story.
Sure.
That Alan's private secretary was Jenny Zeidman. And Jenny was famous not only in working with MUFON, and she was the principal investigator of the Mansfield, Ohio incident, the coin helicopter incident that happened in, I believe it was October of 73, Mansfield, Ohio. And Jenny also worked at Battelle Institute, just down the road from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where Project Blue Book was headquartered. Well, Alan was with Jenny at an awards ceremony, and all at once, Alan slides her a note. We got one. And Jenny slides the note back. Who told you that? And Alan slides a note back, AF, Air Force. So I think there too, that generated a level of, see, we're on the right track.
Right.
They have one in their possession. And whether it was Roswell or Aztec or something thereafter, that I have from a very high source at the Air Force, that we are in possession of physical evidence. And I think that compelled Hynek to, try to, get to the bottom of this while he still had time. And he ran out of time. I'm not going to allow myself to run out of time. We're going to finish this, Alan. We're going to finish this.
Donald, you have been on the right track, and you're on the right track. And thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on tonight.
Let's do it again. We have so much more that we can discuss.
So much more.
Yeah. So I look forward to it. Thank you, Alan. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. All right. Thanks, Don. And quick, Don, where can people find your work or more about you?
Well, all the books, or at least all the recent books, are certainly at Borders, offline bookstores, and certainly on Amazon. And then our website was hacked by a Chinese gambling site. So But I know. But I'm mostly on Twitter, on Facebook, Don47Tom on Twitter, on X, and then on Donald Raymond Schmitt on Facebook.
Perfect.
So, and then I respond to all inquiries and questions, and so I'm very proactive also in reacting as far as the people's questions and comments and suggestions. So
that's
and
awesome.
the museum down in Roswell. Sir.
Oh yeah, that's a sojourn to New Mexico. Definitely worth it.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, Don. Have a good night.
Thank you, Alan. My pleasure.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. So great to have Don on. Thank you guys for joining the chat. I really appreciate your comments and questions. If you have any questions for me regarding the program, you can email me at mystic_lounge@aol.com, or you can go to social media. On Blue Sky, it's Coffee and UFOs. On Instagram, it's Coffee and UFOs podcast. Same thing for Threads. And on X, it's the old @paranormal_. Now, as always, I want to thank the UNX Network for rebroadcasting this podcast on the platform 11 p.m. Pacific time on Thursdays, 2 a.m. Eastern on Fridays. Until next time, everyone, peace and love, and I'll see you on the flip side.
It's good to be an earthling. I wish more of us would think of ourselves that way.
I don't have a problem with skeptics. It's debunkers that are on some other level that I don't understand.
Essentially an inference of a change in local gravity.
Saucer-shaped craft, and they're hovering over the water.
Blue Book Special Report 14. The better the quality of the sighting, the more likely to be unexplainable.